My full name is Brent William Smith. My age is 39, and I was born in Lansing, Michigan.
Okay. How did you first come into poetry, and what drew you specifically to the Detroit poetry scene?
I came into poetry, the Detroit poetry scene around 2007. And it was through a website. And it was through like other poets who were posting their poems online. And so someone connected me to that website. I got on that website somehow. And, to do it in person, you would have to go to, the poetry spots. And so I was 17 years old and I wanted to jump into some poetry. And I went to the spot off of Franklin Road downtown, the Key Club, hosted by Sparrow, and met some poets that I had met online, and got a chance to see some of their poetry online. See their poetry live, and I'm used to seeing their written poems. And so I also remember being on the online chats, and people were, page poets, stage poets. And I didn't want to be a page poet. I wanted to be a stage poet. And so from there, I just jumped at any stage. And one of those stages was the Star Theater, formerly the Star Theater in Southfield, right off of Telegraph. And that was True Essence, where they took part of that theater and they had an open mic style theater. It was perfect for poetry, and it didn't take long before I was coming back every week to perform my poems.
Okay. Do you remember the first poem you ever shared out loud? Where was it, and what inspired it?
So, from a former poetry sense, formal poetry sense, there was a poem I wrote that was called "Shit, I'm Human, Damn, I'm Jazz," and it was like real grown and very adult and too adult for what I probably needed to be writing at 17, 18 years old. I wanted to be like, if I was going to be a poet, I wanted to appear wise. And this was my wise poem. And it was just my affinity for jazz because I'm an old soul, and just, expressing that through a poem. I would say that would be, one of the first ones that I felt I could deliver on the stage, and it would have more impact than it would on the paper.
Okay. Outside of poetry, what kind of work were you doing at the time you entered the scene?
I had so many jobs at that time in college. I was a student, but then I just wasn't a student. And then I was doing valet with Universal Parking. For a little while, I worked at a bank. I was doing all kind of odd jobs just to, pay my poetry bill. Because at this time in, 2008, 2009, you had poetry every night of the week. And so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I could find a stage in Detroit or in Southfield to express myself. And so that was my hustle. I'm at Pizzapopolis, doing tables, because after this, I'm going to go hit a stage. So I was doing a lot of different jobs at that time.
When you say pay your poetry bill, I think that's what you said.
Yes.
Did you mean because they cost?
Yes.
Oh my.
Yes. Your $10, your $5. At that time, I thought it would, I still think, passing or circulating the dollar amongst creatives is something that's very unique. And so when you think about poetry or you think about Black art and you think about all those people coming together every day, it's like we're doing nothing but, a homegrown economy or a creative economy. And so that's something that I really appreciated. And so, yeah, the poetry bill, yeah, like it's like tax, but you're sharing that dollar, amongst like minds, which, always was something that I was about.
Okay. So what was Detroit like socially, politically, or culturally when you first joined the scene?
Socially, I think we were at a time where, we had just elected, the first Black president. And so, while that was, applauded, also, poetry was able to be critical, of the social climate at the time. And so I remember, even downtown Detroit, where, one of the spots we would frequent would be 1515 Broadway. And we were doing our own shows with Chris, rest in peace, Chris, who leased out his venue downtown that is now the Barbershop Social Club, and then Paramita Sound, which, back in that time, it was a black box theater. And so we would host our own shows, and those shows would be, at that time, socially and politically, it was funny to be offensive, more so than it is now. And so to the point where we even had a comedy show with Josh Adams as a headliner, and we called it Hilariously Offensive, right at, 1515 Broadway. So I think, at that time, like, things were certainly in a different place politically, but I also think, creatively, at that time you had a lot of like the old guard changing, which is always happening. But I think on the poetry scene, there was enough poets that were that grew up listening to everything, no different than the kids that are born now. They listen to everything. And so you just had that tipping point of just a lot of young poets.
Okay. These next three questions are about spaces, venues, and events. Yeah. What do you remember about the poetry spaces you came up in? I know you mentioned the Key Club and 1515 Broadway. Where were they and what did they feel like? You want to expand on anything?
What did they feel like and where were the venues? They were all across the city. And one in particular is now where I live. Hunter's Supper Club on Livernois was, 2 nights out of my week because you had Gerard Allen, G, who was hosting Resurrection Wednesdays, which was a weekly poetry night right on the west side of Detroit. And then on Thursdays, you had Exposure Thursdays hosted by Natasha T. Miller and Miles Microphone Phelps, at that time, Young Phenom. And so I think between those 2 nights, I was driving up the lodge, not even knowing, 15 years later, I'd be raising my family, down the street from Hunter's. And then to know like what Hunter's is now, it's abandoned. There's no occupancy there. In fact, the pizza bar that used to be, and half of it is now also gone. And so that's where, one of the spots that I frequented. And then Also on the west side in District 1, in Old Redford neighborhood, you have the Artist Village. And so I was very early on the blossoming of the Artist Village. And, in many ways, John George and Alicia Marion George are mentors of mine. And, I have mad respect for. And I also love seeing the next generation, their children, carrying the business. And so they've always been very accessible. And so that's where we were on a Saturday night. And so when we're looking at a, weekly schedule, Wednesday, let me take it back. Tuesday, I go Monday. Monday, we were at Beans Bytes with Phoenix LaShawn Moore, right there off of Woodward. It's now Passport Pizza. But that was my spot on a Monday night. Tuesday night was Lola's, hosted by Sparrow. And that was downtown, where the Vinyl Society is now. Wednesday was over on Livernois and Hunter Supper Club. Thursday, over on Livernois and Hunter Supper Club. Friday was kind of like a free day. You had Echo on Fridays. Friday was like a free day, but Saturday, Sunday was Artist Village. And then Sunday was True Essence at the theater. But on Saturday at the Artist Village, you knew you were going to get like just a tier 1 show just based off of the band, right? These other spots, it's not Saturday. So, Artist Village had a band, and then you knew you had Katrina Storm, who was going to, sing to the heavens. And you also knew that you was going to get you something to eat, get you something to drink, right? And then comes the Java House, right? And let me just say, like, even with that initiative, right, that's foundationally is with Blightbusters, and the work that John George has done in the Old Redford, Brightmoor neighborhood. But to then grow into what they've become, I just want to make sure I give them their props, because that's where the young poets were, at the Artist Village on a Saturday on the west side of Detroit.
Okay. So besides open mics, what other ways did people share or capture poetry back then?
Besides open mics, what other ways were people capturing poetry back then? So I looked at what was happening like on the academic level, right? And also on the recognition level. And so very quickly, we saw how people were able to publish their own books. Shout out Jessica Care Moore and the Moore Press. She came through to Detroit and said, look, I'm pressing up my own, materials. And so I think with product, I think there was a lane for that, to make product in the form of poetry that was not associated with open mic, with the open mic stage scene. In addition to that, with poetry, you had poets winning awards. You had shout out to Jessica Care Moore being the city's poet laureate. And then you had Namdi Comer, who was the city's poet laureate. But this idea of having a city poet laureate came back because I believe we've had previous poet laureates in the city. And so to me, those pieces, I think, give poetry its own space and love that's outside of, open mic.
Other than books, what other ways do people share their poetry?
I was really into like multimedia. Hindsight is 2020. But I didn't see myself as a YouTube creator. But I could edit my own material. And so I was into transcribing my poems and then putting them up digitally and making like a movie. So like Windows Media Player, I'm like merging files and text, and then even transcribing books. Like I remember Tavis Smiley, during the time of Obama's election, published a book called The Covenant. And there were just all these statistics that affect Black people in the United States of America. And so I thought that was a poem to just lay out the stats. And I called it, study the alarming truths. And I created a video, and to me that was different than a book, because you had images as well. And so I was like constantly editing my own videos, my own poetry videos.
Are there any significant markers or moments or turning points in the Detroit poetry scene worth mentioning?
I think there was a jump from young poets that saw themselves on that stage without a beat was a lane. I think people grew and said, oh, I could, make my own CDs. I can make my own beats. Around this time, you got a bit of a technology jump when it comes to like being able to add music or be your own music creator, like basically the home studio, right? I had my own home studio. And so I ended up making tracks. And so I think that's what changed, was that we had a hip hop influence. And so I didn't want to be, wise poet anymore. I wanted to be MC. And I wanted to create a hip hop group, a hip hop MC group, which was Coleman Young with Lawrence Young or Capelli, Miles Stewart, Mike Phelps, and then Chase Morris, Mike Wright. And so that was our 4-man group. And instead of doing open mics and doing poetry, we were now moving as a hip hop group, or, and doing hip hop shows.
Okay. Influences and collaborations. So who would you say were the voices that shaped you or inspired the scene when you started, locally or nationally?
I would say Joel Fluent Green. I would say from a stylistic, rhythmic, and writing, he was that guy. I would also say Ben Jones was that guy in what he was delivering in his style. I would also add Legacy Leonard, rest in peace, who was one of my mentors, and I was one of her honored courtesans, and she would often remind me of that and certainly encourage me to continue to write and continue to recite my poetry. But so many. Sparrow, rest in peace, Stephen Sparrow. He introduced himself to me as the grandfather of Detroit poetry. Off the rip, like, I don't know this man from Adam, but he said, you need to know me and you need to know, I'm the grandfather of this shit. And he told me that, and he told Miles that, and we were standing at the Star Theater inside True Essence after a show. He wanted to make sure that, we knew who he was.
Okay. Were there any international, city, or statewide collaborations or travels you were a part of or remember happening?
I recall like the national poetry slams, the annual ones. I didn't consider myself a slam poet. And so I was definitely someone who supported the slam artists and followed where they were going and what city they were going to be in. And so I'm talking about, Cassie Poe, Omari King Wise, Blair, Young Phenom, Mike Wright, and then this like constant movement, Natasha T. Miller, like this constant movement of going from city to city just off of the strength of poetry. And so I knew the power of like, words or wordsmithing, but you take that and then, like I said, you add a beat to it, and then now you're taking poetry, you're taking hip hop around the world. And so that's what I was able to do and go as far as France for a festival that is hosted at that time in Saint-Nazaire, France, which is the south of France. And the festival is called Les Escales. And they travel and do a different city every year. But while they're in that city, they pick a sister city to emulate. And so for the year that I traveled, the city was emulating Detroit in France. And so when I think of, the power of the tongue or, where poetry can take you, it could take you around the world. And so I was watching the television shows that were, casting light on, poets' journey as they would even travel to compete in these competitions. Like that's something I found entertaining, and I also thought was a good story. Yeah.
What were some of the TV shows? Do you remember?
Brave New Voices comes to mind. The HBO special. I can't recall any of the other ones, but we had our own Brave New Voices here in the city. We didn't have cameras following us around, but certainly, you had people doing like real major shit at that time, like in the name of poetry, and other poets coming to Detroit from across the country just to get a taste of what we're doing here. And so I always found that fascinating that, people from New York or people from the South, know about the Detroit poetry scene.
Okay. Evolution of the scene. How has the scene evolved since you were involved? What has changed? Stayed the same? How have you changed?
It's been a long time since I would consider myself being in the poetry scene. I think, also part of the shifts had to do with, friendships, right? Or not friendships. And so, some of those, still stand the test of time. And so again, it's like, we're embracing each other as poets, as creatives when we see each other, even though we might not be seeing each other every day of the week now. And so there's, lots of love in that capacity. And I still see, that same fire, that same spirit, from my poets in my community. And so when I see like Tawana Petty, Honeycomb, you know, from the top all the way to the last thing that she says, you're going to hear every word. Like, that's because she's a poet, you know, and she's, you know, doing that at a, you know, a public hearing. So I think in a lot of ways, you know, we're still using our gifts as poets, using our voice as poets, maybe not using it as much for entertainment, and using it for other reasons. I think we're very like, we're like the 2%, you know, in the way like a poet thinks, or the poems that we're writing, you know, when we're, you know, meeting people or viewing the world. I think we have a very unique perspective. So, yeah, I feel like the future, you know, people are so multifaceted, hyphenated, you know, these days. And so I know that there's, you know, so much brilliance, you know, in our poetry scene now without, you know, having to experience it, if that even makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does. Challenges in community health. Have you experienced or witnessed any challenges or harm in the poetry community? How have you or others navigated that?
Certainly there's harm. I would say from my own, you know, community health perspective, like crises are a real thing. And I do recall like being a student, working these jobs, hitting these poetry spots night after night, experiencing my own crises with my mental health. And, you know, the not sleeping, the drinking Red Bulls, the staying up and drinking Hypnotic. It didn't make well for a healthy person. And so I do recall, you know, having 3 nights in a row up, being at Trench Town on Woodward, listening to, you know, reggae, and, you know, just like life was a movie, but it wasn't a good movie. And so just the amount of rest and the amount of like the sabbatical, like one has to take to even recover from something like that. I had that experience. And so from a community health standpoint, you know, I feel like there was harm caused around like just the lifestyle of an artist or the lifestyle of a poet that can be very volatile and unstable. And so I know like in Detroit, it get cold, and I want to never feel that cold again in some of the mental spaces that I was in while I was writing. And so that is like an honor to myself, like as a poet first, as a writer first, to say, you know, make sure like I am giving myself radical self-care, because I need to preserve, like these words need to preserve, and having the fire to, you know, continue to preserve is something that I care really deeply about.
Mm-hmm. So these next 2 questions, I can always circle back, but do you have, and one is just like a yes or no, so I can make note. Do you have any photos, flyers, newspaper clippings, articles, books, or video footage you'd be willing to share for the archive?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a poem about Detroit, the scene, or your experience in it that you would like to share or have remembered?
Yes.
Would you feel comfortable sharing it right now?
A part of it.
Okay.
A part of it. It's called A Woman's Window. and I wrote it to get to know a woman, somebody that I was trying to talk to, and this is the poem that came up. A wise man once wrote, "A woman without her man is nothing." And so with me being a pragmatist, I did some cognitive analysis and asked myself, does this theory hold up in good light? It might. A wise man once wrote, "A woman without her man is nothing. But a woman without her man is nothing. Pretty brown eyes." There's more.
Okay.
There's more.
That was good though. Good play on words.
I did the intro and I did the outro. But that piece ended up going to New York with the dancers from Wayne State, two dancers, Lauren Chancellor, or now Lauren Taylor, and Jessica Smart. And I had movement with my poetry, and I would love to find that archival footage because that poem took me across the country and dancing with poetry.
That's amazing. Yeah. Community impact and cultural significance. What do you feel are the positive contributions of the Detroit poetry scene to the city of Detroit and its people?
I think there's a long lineage. I'm only talking about my era of poetry, right? But I know that it precedes me. And so from an academic level, I was introduced to Dudley Randall. I was introduced to Dudley Randall by Melba Boyd, who was my professor at Wayne State. I was not her best student. Let me just say that. But she's even been recognized for the work that she's done in poetry in collaboration with Dudley Randall. Naomi, it's not Watts. I can't think of her last name, but another poet that, Detroit's legacy is built on. I got a chance to know her in her older age at church, of all places, and then for her to receive the Kresge Eminent Award for poetry. And so when we talk about the landscape, it's very vast and it predates, some of the things that I've been talking about.
Come on, Naomi Long Madjet.
Thank you.
Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4 more questions. Doing great. If you could name the era of poetry you came into, what would you call it?
So I want to be witty, but I'm gonna call it what it is. It was the Coleman Young era for me, because that's where I found my tribe in the city. You had multiple factions, of poets and MCs, and people are clicked up. And so to me, as far as the range of what we could do lyrically, I saw ourselves as excellent.
Okay. Where do you think Detroit poetry will be in the next 10 years? What do you hope for it?
I would say in 10 years, it would be 2036. My oldest would be 16. My youngest would be 13. I would hope that spoken word would be influenced in their life, and they would be writers my children love to write. I think that comes from me and my wife. And I would want them to continue to read and seek poetry. I come from a philosophy, and this is my philosophy, that the world is a text, and it's a book that I read in college, and that's the cover, and I can clearly visualize the cover. But the world being a text, to me, is the essence of life. Like, read signs, read symbols for the conscious mind, because it pays. And so that's what I would want, to be the future of poetry.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of a quote by Paulo Freire. The word is the word. No, in order to understand the world, you need to know the word, or something like that. Understand. Something like that. Yes. If you had unlimited resources, time, how would you choose to uplift the Detroit poetry scene?
I would, let me be politically correct. I would get a commercial building. And when I say I would, it wouldn't be me, it would be, the community. But I believe we need a space. I believe we need a commercial space. I know we have commercial spaces. However, I do think there's something sweet about entertainment and education. And some of our venues in the city do it well. Nandi's comes to mind, right? Where I know I'm going to be stimulated, and I know I'm also going to be entertained. And so I think we have, the spaces to, program. I just would want to have something every day of the week for all age, or for a range of ages. Something for the adults, something for the kids, something for families, something for singles, something for married folks. Like, poetry is healing, and I would just have more hubs and more spaces for emotional trauma healing that poetry can offer.
Anything else worth mentioning?
I would just say that when it comes to hip hop and when it comes to poetry, Detroit is something in the water, and we bring out the best lyricists with the word. And that could be over a beat, that could be a cappella, that could be a monologue. We do it the best. And I can't overemphasize that.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Nice.